We're going to talk to Jamie Jenkins in this hour because, of course, the lockdown files have fascinated him and repulsed him in equal measure, I suspect. Britain's second lockdown, and we heard this already from our last guest, Richard, was based on very wrong COVID data. And Boris Johnson was worried about it. Let's find out from Jamie precisely what's going on. Jamie, very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Mike. I think I wonder how many more people have just joined the far right from Sadiq Khan's definition in the last 15 minutes.
I think it's a lot of people that disagree with him, basically, isn't it? I mean, this is the ridiculous thing about the way he operates, is that, you know, people are now quite happily self-identifying as far right just to annoy him.
Well, absolutely mental, Mike. But yeah, but going on to this story about the COVID data, I think I obviously started coming on with you first, Mike, many years ago.
Yes.
I was kind of looking at the data, kind of in my role. I used to work at the ONS and look at the health stats, and was come on with you quite regularly through the pandemic. And we were looking at the data at the time, and yeah, it's good to see, I suppose, with these lockdown files that have been leaked. And I remember we're only seeing Matt Hancock's ones. I'd be interested to see, you know, what Boris Johnson's WhatsApp look like and Chris Whitty's, because they would have been communicating amongst themselves outside of Matt Hancock as well. Whether or not we'll ever see that, Mike, is another question. But Boris is now, I think, going into this second lockdown, questioning the data, saying, oh, should we be going into kind of the lockdown? Have I been a bit hasty? I think that's kind of the upshot. And remember, Mike, when we had all these models that were going on predicting, you know, Armageddon, how many deaths we were going to get, how many hospitalizations we were going to get, the problem you have there, Mike, is that if you do intervene and do something, you can't mark the homework. But what we then did, because Boris, I think, was getting a bit fed up as we got further and further into the pandemic. And what we had is that in September 21, I think there were calls for Boris to bring in Plan B measures. We won't go into the detail about what they were, but it was more restrictions. And they said, the Sage modelling said, Mike, if you don't do this, we'll have 3,000 hospitalizations a day. It never rose above 900. Boris didn't do anything, and it never went above 900. And then in December 21, remember that Omicron variant hit, and the government were told, if you don't go further again now, you're going to get 3,000 deaths per day. And they went about 200 per day, 93% lower, Mike. So you look at this modelling that was going on where we could mark the homework, it questions the whole thing. And to me, you know, the one thing, the biggest lesson we've got to learn from this pandemic, Mike, is the modelling was absolute nonsense. And major decisions were made off the back of it.
Yeah. And also, you know, in my book, you don't get something 93% reduced without calling it wrong. So basically, it's not so much that the modelling was 93% less, the actual number of people who died was 93% less. Their predictions were wrong. Simple as that.
Oh, absolute nonsense, Mike, as well. You know, you put garbage into a model, you're going to get garbage out, and then you've got a question. You know, we've just seen one of the individuals working in Sage, who was part of the COVID modelling group, promoted to become the new kind of chief scientific advisor, replacing Patrick Vallance. And, you know, this is the type of stuff, Mike, you know, just a little sense check. And there was many, you know, scientists, mathematicians, modelers who were criticising this at the time, but they were kind of all shut out saying, oh, no, you can't be doing this, you can't be listening to them. And what we've seen, Mike, as well, is that every wave of COVID since we've kind of gone into this living with COVID kind of scenario, the cases go up for about 4, 5, 6 weeks, and they naturally start coming down again. And the question is, would that have happened if we didn't have these lockdowns in the pandemic when we did have them? Possibly that might have happened.
Interesting. I mean, the tweet that you can see on the screen now, if you're watching us on live TV, is one from Boris Johnson, in which, because Boris apparently, this is back in November of 2020, at the beginning of the month, he was worried that he was plunging Britain into a second lockdown, and he was being told that the scientists had said the data was very wrong. So the scientists in this occasion actually were obviously telling him the truth, but he was listening to other people, including his kind of media advisors, and you can see from this tweet that they decide to start relying on polling to say to people, well, it's obvious that more and more people want the lockdown to go ahead, more and more people want to be kept safe, and it was never more than 50-50 by the looks of it.
Yeah, what we did have, Mike, especially early on in the pandemic, I think Hancock and Cummins, when you look at these files, were kind of texting each other around some of the polling stuff. And one of the questions was, YouGov was asking, would you support another 3 weeks kind of national lockdown? I think this was in April 2020 at the time, Mike. And the problem you've got there, Mike, is if you basically, you've had a press conference pretty much daily, everybody's saying, oh, there's so many deaths, and deaths have been going up here, and there's so many cases we might have. of course, people might think, oh, well, let's have another 3 weeks lockdown. Imagine if the question was, would you allow the government to continue to have lockdowns for the next kind of several months, and then another one at Christmas time, and then further ones, and then, you know, things like we'll close kind of hospitality down quite a lot. We'll block aisles off supermarkets like we had in Wales. If the question was a bit more kind of blunt and asked that, I doubt they would have had the support that they've got. And I think one thing we've got to remember, Mike, with these lockdown files, there's a lot of talk about what the government were doing of the day. But I just want to remind the viewers and the listeners, on July the 7th, this is about 2 weeks now before Freedom Day in England, Keir Starmer stood up at Prime Minister's questions and he criticised Boris. He said he was reckless. He says the Sage Papers are kind of citing that we will have 100,000 cases per day. And he called Boris reckless. It didn't happen, Mike, when Boris, he went ahead. We didn't have 100,000 cases a day. And I want to remind people, you know, that if Starmer was in power, you know, this is what we're looking at with the next election, potentially. We would have had harder lockdowns. There would have been longer lockdowns. And the irony and the hypocrisy of Starmer at that time, Mike, on July the 7th, he said that. And on July the 8th, it's in the Register's Member of Interest, you receive free tickets for the Euro final to go and mix with loads of people at Wembley. You know, this is the hypocrisy of these politicians, mate.
Absolutely right. But also, I mean, the media as well have to play a role here, because I seem to remember at every single one of those press conferences, you need to get the likes of Beth Rigby and Robert Peston consistently asking questions about why lockdown wasn't happening faster, why it wasn't going on longer, why it wasn't being made harder. And I think at one point, Beth Rigby, and this was after she'd been caught out going to a party with Kay Burley, right, actually accused the Prime Minister of being reckless. She used that word, I remember it.
Yeah, and Starmer used the word reckless, the media were doing. It was pretty much, Mike. I think when you talk about the kind of the messages that were going out across these, you know, government officials and the ministers and the Prime Minister and the press, a lot of it was kind of driven by the media, because the government obviously don't want criticism. And if Laura Koonsberg, Peston, Beth Rigby, they were all there, I remember at the time saying, yeah, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? They were already doing quite a lot of things that in hindsight, you probably think that was a bit too far. They were driving a lot of this, the media. And journalists like yourself, I would have loved to have seen you in one of these press conferences.
Yeah, I never got a sniff of it. They wouldn't invite me in there because they knew I'd ask them a proper question, you know. I mean, because it was absolutely extraordinary. And who can forget as well all of those graphs that Whitty used to produce? And I mean, funnily enough, all of these lockdown files are kind of painting Whitty as a different person than the guy I remember, because I remember Whitty being quite misleading about some of his graphs that he put up, because some of the times he would show what looked like a big rise. He cut off the historical part, which would have shown actually it wasn't as big a rise as the one from the previous year.
Yeah, there was a classic day, I think. It was a Saturday evening, Mike. It was, you know, live on the Nation. I think they had to delay some stuff on the BBC for this kind of press conference. It was an emergency one, you know. If it's called on a Saturday evening, prime time, when they want to put some kind of game shows on, you know, it must have been a biggie. And I remember watching him, right, and it was literally slide after slide. You remember the old thing, next slide, please, next slide, please. And I'm a statistician, and I struggle to understand half of the stuff that they were presenting. I don't know if it was deliberate to confuse the population and scare the population into saying, yeah, we're going to have more measures. But yeah, it was absolute carnage. And I was on with you, I think, the following week, right, criticising that at the time. And you're right. You know, and Whitty coming out saying there was no strong argument for masks, no real strong argument against it, but let's go and do it anyway. You know, the government went ahead and did it anyway because they didn't want an argument with Nicola Sturgeon. You know, absolute scandalous, Mike, absolute scandal. No evidence, you don't do something. And that's the problem we've got here. Little evidence was used sometimes for big, big decisions.
Yes. And as far as the other findings that we've seen so far, and I'm sure there's going to be an awful lot more coming up as the days continue. Isabel Oakeshott told me yesterday that you're going to see a lot more stuff about how individuals actually behaved and how much further out of touch they are than we think they are. And I'm talking about people like Jacob Rees-Mogg asking for a testing kit, Helen Whately asking for a testing kit for a member of her family. You know, they seem to be operating in this kind of bubble where they think they're better than everybody else.
Oh, no, indeed, Mike. You could just see that, obviously, with the Partygate scandal, that I think the messages that were going out say of our own people landing first class and then being shoved into a Premier Inn.
Yeah.
And when we went to these quarantine.
Well, that was another one, wasn't it? I'd forgotten about. I mean, there's so much that I've forgotten about that you've reminded me of there. There's the people that, I used to get calls from people who said, I've come into the airport, they basically put everybody from all the flights into one big room. So the idea that we're being sort of quarantined is an absolute joke. They were then put on buses with loads of people and taken to about 65 different, you know, hotel destinations. And it was just totally and utterly mad.
Well, it was up at the madness, and again, Mike, it was costing people money. And you've got messages, you know, between senior civil servants kind of joking about it all, and it's an absolute travesty, Mike. And obviously, we've got the COVID inquiry going on at the moment. I do agree with people; we need to open up the books more, but much faster than what we're having with the COVID inquiry. And there's going to be some damning stuff. But let's not forget, Mike, as I said. No, what you would think is if you had a government who was opposing some of this stuff, there would be a government in waiting to say, well, next time do a better job. We had a government in kind of power and an opposition who would have gone even worse, Mike. So
well, exactly.
It doesn't look bode well for the next election that you've got an incoming government potentially from the Labour Party where it would have been more shambolic than what it actually was.
Yeah, absolutely right.